Now the first one was just assist your own respiration. But then if you didn't, I put on there, so if you didn't take a breath within a certain amount of time, it would give you a breath. So it was an assistant controller. So we could take and one of the first uses, we had a sister, Kenny. I think she's out of Minneapolis. And the docs didn't think too much of her. What she wanted to do was take and get these patients out and massage their legs and arms and extremities so they didn't lose their muscle mass. And it was good, but they had to breathe during this period of time. And she found about what we were doing at Bellevue Hospital in New York. And she came down and visited, I remember there, and I met her there. And she told me exactly what she wanted to do. And I remember I made a couple prototype respirators. We were checking them there for early respirators. And she took them out, and she got fantastic results. And later on, we would take these patients in their lungs. They might sleep in there, and we'd tether them. We had an exhalation valve, so she had them walking and exercise, and it became a standard. And she did very, very well. So first, with lots of polio patients, we got them out of the lung. And remember, these were bulbar, a lot of them at the end. So.
Now you talk about the magnets. Can you explain what you did? What was the breakthrough?
What happened was, in the middle, I had a sliding valve. And in one direction it was on, the other direction was off. So I brought oxygen in, or air, and I had a metering valve in there. And the biggest problem was you had to determine how fast the gas went into the lung, or you could destroy a lung or not at all. And I wasn't in on it, but I learned early by reading in aviation, where they first started the first de-icing boots out on the wings of an airplane. And it stated, the wings, you got blocks of ice out on the wingtip, you got that to the fuselage, it took the ice very well. And they solved that by just flowing the rate they blew these and up and slowed down. And I figured, well, hell, the lung's not exactly like that, but it was a problem. And I did. From that, I learned to put flow rate on right from the earliest times. So that really came from aviation. And that helped a lot. So I had a flow rate control, and I had this sliding valve, and I had soft iron plates on the end, and I had magnets on each end. And what would happen basically is I would have one holding it off, and you did that, the slightest against the diaphragm would switch it on. And then the other one, it would switch on, and when you reach that pressure in there, it would switch off. And this was exactly what we had in the, now the anti-G suit regulator was the same configuration, only it was vertical. And the top magnet, 1.5 Gs, 1 G, another 1.5 G, it would drop here and it would turn on. And it would squeeze the calves, the thighs, and the splanchnic area and hold the blood up in the cranial vault. And then, of course, when you took the G load off, bang, it would reset itself. And it's still pretty much today pretty simple. So that worked out pretty good.
Similar models even today?
Yes, the only difference was actually the military anti-G was vertical and this was horizontal. Yeah. Okay, as far as the infant was concerned, now at that time, let's say you had an infant born prematurely and they had a breathing problem, which a lot of them did. They would take them, put them in what was called a croup tent. It was just a cylinder, and then they keep the temperature and stuff. And they would run oxygen in, and then they would humidify the oxygen and so on. And at that time, 30% of those babies would survive and be fine. The other 70% went on to die, but they never knew why. They just really didn't know why. But a problem they had basically, out of the 30% would survive, some of them were blinded. In other words, for no reason at all, permanently blinded. Good normal kids, but lost their sight. And then a gal by the name of Virginia Apgar, she was a physiologist, anesthesiologist at Columbia Press. She was a tremendous lady with great knowledge. And I think we probably have to give her most of the credit, because she said, I think we're giving him too much oxygen. You know, nobody paid much attention. Well, then they really started, and she started to show them. And indeed, that was the problem. But then they cut back on oxygen, not enough, and we had hypoxic deaths, not enough oxygen on them. And about that time, I developed the oxygen breathing regulator. In other words, it would take oxygen and air and mix the two, and you just dialed in 21% to 100%, and that took care of that. And later on we realized oxygen toxicity, and then of course we used that to ventilators. That's still in production after all these years. Yeah, 1960. When the hell did I develop that? I think 63 on the oxygen regulator. Yeah,
sort of blending oxygen.
It would blend oxygen and air together, so you could dial exactly, so you didn't get too much oxygen or you got enough. And it was a calibrated knob from 21. It only had an error of maybe 1.5%, 2%. It was pretty accurate. We still use them today.
Some article I read said something that your work has actually reduced the infant mortality rate.
When we started, we had a 70% mortality rate. And I guess they claim, I don't know, it was probably within 2 years it was less than 10%. But we dramatically reduced it, that for sure. I don't know whether exactly that or not. But we did. And today, we really lose these kids. We really. Now, you know, there's two sides to this all the way through. We started to take these kids, and boy, I tell you, things that would be an abortion. We brought, and these kids had hardly any resistance. They did well, but we had good docs too. We had the pediatricians that became neonatologists with this, and they just learned and worked that out tremendously. But we did have one problem. You've probably read the horror stories where somebody turned a ventilator off and who makes the decision. But for gosh sake, if you've got a kid, the good Lord doesn't mean you've got all kinds of congenital problems all the way through. Why do it? Because first of all, that kid's going to die, and they're very young, and they're going to have miseries, they're going to bankrupt the family, all of these things. But yet, who's going to take and make a decision? Well, something like that, you shouldn't put the kid on to begin with. In other words, then you're playing God, in my estimation. And I'm not one to say, I have no authority on that at all. But I think they're more careful today. And we just don't see that. So you never turn a respirator off. You're just careful who you start and so on. And I think that's part of the learning curve.
You started when you're your own guy, and then you have your own company now, and you've grown.
I started initially. It was kind of interesting. The first one I made, and this would have been now again 1943. I had a fellow pilot, and he lived in Long Beach. And his daddy was a World War I pilot like mine. And of course, he'd long since retired. But he had what was called emphysema. And that was before I'd gone to school. I really didn't know. And he had an inhaler. He was called an atomizer. And it was a glass atomizer with a bulb on it. And he was doing that. And his mom was a great cook. And I was fortunate enough, Bob would invite me to his home. And when we were in together, probably maybe once every other month. But I watched his dad, and he was doing this. And then I thought, gee whiz, if we put some pressure behind this and force that aerosol down in the lung, it might be good. I was guessing. I didn't know. I had one prototype of my respirator, and I got a doorknob from the hardware store, and I put that on top. And what would happen is, and I still use I didn't have a mouthpiece or anything at that time, but I used the mine safety appliance. It was better rigged by that time to make a little mask. And what he would do, he'd push down on that, and he would fill his lungs, but he could control how fast he filled his lungs. And when they felt fill, he reduce it, and then exhale out before he started the next breath. And I fixed it so it would give him his medication instead of squeezing this. It was power, and he could control the pressure. Well, I made that, and I gave it to him and showed him how to use it. And I got back from a trip sometimes later, and his doctor called and said, "Hey, geez, Mr. Barlow's doing fantastically well. In other words, I need more of these." And I said, "That's the only prototype I've got." But now after the war was over, they came up surplus, some of these breathing, and we got, I think, 2,500 of them. They were brand new in the boxes for $1.50 a piece or some crazy thing. But I was still in the military. But down at Palm Springs, where I had my shop set up, we started to put those together. Some fellows that were out of the military started to take and put together these units. And they went out to patients that had pulmonary disease, emphysema, and so on, and worked very, very well. So I was still in the military, but I saw what they were actually doing to patients and so on. So that worked out pretty good.
So you ended up starting your own company?
Yes, I did. Bird oxygen breathing, I called it. Yeah, I was still in the military, but I did this on the side. And then, of course, after I got the other, and a number of years, then I started Bird Corporation. Then, of course, we were making them, and I had them made up in San Francisco by National Welding Equipment. They made the devices for me. I did a lot of the teaching. Of course, I had the time and so on. And then finally, we brought everything into Palm Springs and manufactured everything there.
You also do CPAP?
Yeah, CPAP we started in 1964. And continuous positive pressure, everybody thinks that's a cure-all for everything. But the problem is, if you have somebody, the right side of the heart pumps your blood through the lungs over the left side. But if you don't have that blood going around the circle and coming back to the right side, it's a problem. And if you use CPAP and you increase the pressure in the thoracic cage, it blocks the blood coming back to the right side. And what happens is, it raises the pressure against, and if you have right-sided heart strain or anything, you can get into trouble. So if you go too much on this type of patient population with CPAP, you're going to get in trouble. And they use too much. It's just a panacea. It really is all the way through. Now, I'm not saying CPAP is bad, because if you take a normal patient, you can redistribute the blood maybe a little bit. I use a different form of it in our equipment now. See, we don't do that anymore. We do this inside the lung. So actually, we control the pumping action of the heart as well as the breathing. Yeah.
So you've come What's your goals for the future?
You know, I've probably reached everything that I set out to do. And the thing I set out to do actually was every mechanical ventilator we ever had, including my first 3 generations, you would increase the mean pressure in the thoracic cage, and you depress cardiac output. So I always wanted to make, and I didn't think it was possible, a unit that would actually take and not impair cardiac output. And in 1921, a fellow named Ralph Waters at Madison, Wisconsin, he was the dean of modern day anesthesiology. He had a patient die on the table, but he was prepared. And he wanted to prove if you took and put pressure in the lung like that, you'd pump the heart. And what he did was he ran a cut down on the leg. He had a patient die on the table, but he was prepared. So he splinted the chest, in other words, tight all the way through. And then he connected one of the endotracheal tubes, but he made a tube and put it in and had it tight somehow. I don't know how he did it. And he took and flushed gas in his gas machine and did this. And he measured gas. In other words, blood would flow out of that. So it shows he was compressing there. So that was the first thing in the literature. And I saw that years earlier. And probably, oh boy, I don't know, I'd say probably in 71 or 72, I had followed kind of what he did, only more sophisticated. And we ran animal studies at Jefferson back in Philadelphia to prove it on animals, which worked fine. And then at the University of Pennsylvania, they had patients who were absolutely going to die. I mean, there was just no question about 3 or 4 physicians. They were going to die. And we started using it on some of those patients. And we did. 2 of them went on, and they had just had cardiac arrests all the way through. But we ran, I think, a series of about 5 patients. We proved that you could do it, but it wasn't feasible because, you know, it was too much jury rigging and so on. So I tried that. And now we developed this. Of course, I've had that available now. Essentially, we call it vesicular peristalsis. And of course, typically when you come out with something new in medicine, well, prove it, you know, all the way through. We're from Missouri. And we have proven it. And really it augments. In other words, every time your heart beats and so on in there, the circulations are affected that are in your chest. There's 3 circulations. And we call it vesicular peristalsis. And now we know why we don't depress. And we've gone just about, I think, probably within the last year, I finally got what is the last link on making the ventilation so they can use it both in the hospital and home. Now we probably got 50 million home patients with obstructive lung like emphysema and so on. And if we can get these patients early and have these home units under good medical supervision, so they watch their diet and hygiene, all of these things, it looks very, very good. So I've gone, I think, as far as I can go, and I'm 88 years old, of course, now, and I have to consider that.